Hope everybody's having a wonderful day. It's been a very busy day and a busy weekend here in Durham, North Carolina, where I am based at. And all along those lines, as a matter of fact, I just came back from doing a presentation about the Black Wall Street and the importance of history and the legacy around some of that history that exists right here in this area with a group of women entrepreneurs and women activists and all in that space. They came from all over. I think one of the young ladies that told me she was from Texas. There were a couple from New York. Some of them have even been on YouTube and all in that space. So they were here, and apparently they've been to other countries like Ecuador and places like that, and are oftentimes trying to find ways to reimagine a better world and all along those lines. So definitely Kiana had got in touch with me and told me that they would love to have me do a presentation about some of the historical legacy that exists here in Durham, North Carolina. So I was glad to do that, and had done a similar kind of talk, but this dealt more with things in the space of health and first aid and all along those lines. And that was done on this past Wednesday. So about 5 days ago on the campus of Duke University, I was even having some of the students there be engaged in some great conversations as we talked about gentrification, urban renewal, and a number of other things at that particular talk as well. And then on the Friday, as y'all know, I work at the Hayti Heritage Center, and we had a new art exhibit that is talking about the Divine Nine. So the Divine Nine is the Black fraternities and sororities. As a matter of fact, Kamala Harris belongs to one of those sororities, our current vice president, and all along those lines. So we had a conversation and a movie that the young lady did, Cameron Elsie, and it's a very powerful movie. It needs to have some editing done, but it's still a great movie that talks about that history and all along those lines. And then there are some pictures that she took as well, and that is what is currently on display at the Hayti Heritage Center. So there was a couple of food trucks that were there. Well, actually one for like a food tent and two food trucks that were there. And of course there was some music, and folks were just having a good old time at that third Friday event, which was this past Friday. And on Saturday, we picked our new Poetry Slam team. So the next year, they'll be celebrating their 20th anniversary and all in that space. So they definitely picked that particular slam team, and they some great poems. Some of them that dealt with family issues or some of the issues around relationships. Some of them that dealt with race relations and a number of other things. But they are going to be going to Pompano Beach. I believe that's in June for the Southern Fried competition and all along those lines. So that was definitely something that was going on. And then the Hebrew Israelites, some of their people from all over the world. I would actually say, because the gentleman told me there were some from London and Barbados and other places, as well as up and down the East Coast and throughout the United States. But they did their Passover event. I believe that was in Snow Hill on, because they had done it last year in Raleigh on on Saturday, and then on Sunday they did an event at the Hayti Heritage Center, and there was about a good crowd of folks at that. I'd say around 150, 200, or something along those lines. So definitely a lot of things that are taking place, and a lot of people are doing some great work in that space and all along those lines. But I'm definitely glad that we're having some cooler weather. I think it was about 60 while I was doing that walk. As a matter of fact, some of the ladies were bundled up in their coats, and of course I had on my sweater. And of course there was some time because we had some pretty good rain yesterday that actually canceled. As a matter of fact, one of my cousins came up to attend the annual powwow up in Hollister with the Hollawassa Pony Tribe, and they actually had to cancel their last day of events, which would have been yesterday, because of the rain and all in that space. They did have stuff on Friday and Saturday, and I need to get in touch with cousin Jonathan and see how that all turned out and all in that space. But definitely there are great things happening, and the weather is cooperating right now, even though I understand the temperatures are going to spike back up, might get back into the 80s or the 90s or something along those lines. But we'll see how the weather is treating Miss Cassandra where she's at, because she is the founder of Firsthand Research. And of course, they're doing some great things around marketing and investment, even investment strategies, and all along those lines. I'll bring her up and learn more about what she's got going on as well, because one of the things, the reason that they founded this particular network is because both Nick Palveda and Kim Calhoun are feeling that we are not doing enough in terms of teaching about our entrepreneurial spirit and even getting folks engaged. Because one of the things I was talking about, even with the young ladies, is how a lot of times folks have generational wealth and they have generational space, but sometimes it only goes for a couple of generations. And then after those generations are passed on to other folks, they decide not to go into that family business and all along those lines. Because I know that even in the whole notion of what can go on with the newspaper field, because I had a couple of friends that worked for the Carolina Times. It doesn't exist anymore and all in that space. So they had a very successful newspaper, and it was one that was doing quite well and all along those lines. But unfortunately, uh, new family members came along and they didn't want to necessarily participate anymore in that space and wanted to get involved in other ways and find other things to do. Maybe they wanted to go into a whole nother space other than that their family was known for and all in that kind of way. So that is something that we know happens on a regular basis, that sometimes people don't understand the power of what they have at their hand and they are willing to let it go. And sometimes that means that it is not being as supported as much as it probably should be and all along those lines. So that is a part of the conversations that we have regularly here on the network. Because like I said, both Nick Palveda and Kim Calhoun, who is the other founder, are very much about this notion of fiscal literacy and the importance of fiscal literacy and why it is so important in our lives. You gotta love technology. Technology has a mind of its own sometimes, and all along those lines. But as you were hearing me talk about, a lot of times there is a lot of concerns around fiscal literacy and the importance of fiscal literacy. And I know that Nick Balveda, who's one of the founders, is a pension attorney, and he's definitely a big proponent about how we need to teach more around fiscal literacy. I've even heard him argue that we should be teaching about the budget and maybe even having people understand the budget as early as high school and college and all in that space. But definitely glad to reach out to you and hear a lot about what you're doing with your business and everything. So if you can tell folks more about the organization that you have and definitely how you are helping people develop that entrepreneurial dream as well.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yes.
So I would start with saying that the I started this company about 6 months ago, really. I had sold my business and I had had this idea for a couple of years floating around and decided that I now had the time. One of the things that I've noticed over the last 25 years in the investment business is people tend to just listen to what they think the so-called experts are telling them.
Right.
And they get a little lazy about doing the legwork and the research for themselves. And of course, there's merit to using paid experts. But the bottom line is, as you mentioned, we're not teaching anything in the schools these days. I mean, unfortunately, I know kids that can't even add change up.
Mhm.
It's really quite amazing. So um, the basis for the tools that we're developing, they're really software tools,
Right.
is to help people that are not finance people but are interested in investing look at things about potential investments without being intimidated with numbers. So we're using the latest technologies to be able to provide people the opportunity to discern for themselves whether something looks like it's a good investment or not. And along with that, provide them with the education of what things to look for to determine if it's a good investment or not.
Yeah,
I'm
along
not
those same kind of
social.
lines and everything, because I know a lot of times people are hearing about all these amazing investments. We actually have an investment show that Sasha Star does, and I know that he's very big on NVIDIA and all in that
Yeah.
space. But then sometimes people will be looking at some of these investments and going like, I've got a few dollars here or a few dollars left here and everything, and they'll say, can I really invest in some of these major companies and all along these lines? And I've even got some friends, and I don't know your views about this, that are getting very much involved and interested in what they call blockchain technology and around the
Mhm.
Bitcoin kind of space as well. So I was just wondering, do y'all talk about that as well? Because I actually have a coworker of mine at the Cultural Arts Center that I mentioned, and I know he's very much into the blockchain space and seems to be doing well, despite the fact that they just did some halving and all in that space. But like I said, he seems to be working on trying to make some revenue that way. But I just wanted your take on the different investment tools and whether you look at all of the investment tools or is it strictly more of the stock market kind of investments.
Well, right now, the tool we're working on is specific to the stock market, but a
Mhm.
lot of I'm on social media all the time and trying to educate people about, as you mentioned, blockchain. Blockchain is a huge deal.
Right.
Back in the day, back in the mid 90s, that was the beginning of the World Wide Web.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're about to go into Web 3,
Right.
which is all based on the blockchain. And it shouldn't be confused with cryptocurrency.
Right.
Bitcoin itself is a totally different thing. It really is like another currency. Just like if we went to England or, France, we're using euros, we're using pounds. That's what Bitcoin is. All the other ones, though, are not quite the same as Bitcoin because they have unlimited supply,
Mm-hmm.
which Bitcoin doesn't. And that's why they do the halving
Right.
so that the miners don't. Um, it's to keep the supply and demand more equal. It deflates the fees that the miners get for mining a Bitcoin because there's only going to be a total of 21 million Bitcoins out there
Right.
forever. And so, to slow down the pace of the mining, they disincentivize the miners by cutting in half the fee they get paid. So that kind of takes a little bit of the steam out, but it also takes some of the inflationary pressures out of the price too.
Right.
Unlike the US dollar, of course.
Yeah.
So
Very much unlike the U.S. dollar, and definitely that's very much the case and everything. What point in your life did you know? Because I know that there was a time, because I think even when I was in college, I vaguely remember going out and maybe selling the Hoover vacuums and maybe even some of the encyclopedia, if memory is serving me correctly, and all along those lines. But it wasn't my forte. But I did have friends that were in that whole notion of setting up lemonade stands and doing other kinds of business ventures and all along those lines. So I was just wondering, at what point did Cassandra know that she was going to be in the investment space and possibly even in the finance space? So was this something that you did early on in life? Did your parents have you have an allowance or maybe a savings bond that you had to be in control of and all of this line, or is this something that became an interest later on in life?
Well, for sure, I had a an allowance every week that I had to work for. I couldn't just say, "Okay, it's Friday, where's my little allowance?" I mean, I actually had to do things for it. And I saw my father, who was his own business owner, and I saw how hard he worked, but I saw how rewarding it could be and that he could have a balanced life,
Mhm.
right? So I was fortunate. My dad was there for me, on weekends, things like that. Didn't have to work all the time, and so I guess I was about 11 or 12. I started asking my parents about the stock market.
Mhm.
They were not big into the stock market at all. But they appreciated the fact that they had a kid that was interested in it. And so they had a friend that worked for a publicly traded local bank in Pennsylvania. And so they went and talked to him and he said, "Oh, buy her a couple shares of the bank stock and she can follow it." So that's what I did. And I didn't put two and two together that that was going to be a career path. It
Mhm.
was just something I was interested in. I actually had always wanted to be a lawyer, and I actually, went to school at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. Didn't take one economic or financial course whatsoever. I was all in on government and law, constitutional law, and so I went to law school.
Okay.
And it wasn't until I was literally in my first year of law school, I would come home from class, and this was, again, the mid 90s,
Mhm.
early 90s, and I would turn on the TV, and there was this new TV channel on called CNBC.
Yes, I
And it
remember that.
was all the financial ticker all day and all the talking heads. And I was fascinated by all of the different concepts. And I realized in my mind, the only way to get involved in the investment and financial space was going to be if you wanted to be a stockbroker.
Right.
And I knew I didn't want to do that. I didn't feel I had the sales ability, if you will, to do something like that. So actually, in my first year of law school, a light bulb went off, and I said, I can't do this 2 more years.
Mhm.
I want to go and learn about investing and business. And so I dropped out of law school after the first year and I went and I got my MBA.
Okay.
And once I switched schools, I realized there were so many different aspects of the financial industry that I knew nothing about. And so my world became much bigger. And I realized the part that I was interested in and probably had a knack for was picking the investments.
Mm.
And so that's how I got on the career path of becoming an equity analyst, which can lead to becoming ultimately a portfolio manager, for some people as
Yeah.
well.
Mhm. He
Yeah.
was actually one of our gentlemen that comes on this show, particularly on the news show. He used to come on more regularly, but lately he's been working on a couple of big deals and all along those lines. But he is a hedge fund manager, so
Hmm.
definitely should kill that. Amir is out of Australia, and he's definitely managed a bunch of hedge funds and managed them quite well and all in that space. But that is something that I know he's done. And like I said before, Nick Palveda is a pension attorney, so a lot of the people he's working with are folks that have got their pensions and are trying to figure out what to do with those pensions and how to invest the pension money that they may have had even in that kind of venture and everything. And
Yeah.
ironically, one of the things that I was talking to the young ladies about earlier is there are a number of them throughout the country, but there are several Black Wall Streets, and many people
Mhm.
know Tulsa, Oklahoma, and sometimes they'll hear Rosewood because there was a whole movie made about Rosewood. But there was also Durham, North Carolina, and sometimes you get education that you're not expected to get and everything because one of the founders of what was well, two things. One, the insurance business can be a major financial kind of windfall for a lot of people, and it can help them do well in their finances depending on how they handle their insurance. So North Carolina Mutual was a major insurance company that existed for years here in this area and all along those lines. But definitely some of those founders were also learning at the feet of some of the robber barons of the day. So definitely Mr. Merrick was a barber, and there was some segregated barbershops at the time. So you
Yeah.
had even though he's an African American barber, he had barbers that he was able to do that were strictly white customers and some that were strictly African American customers. But when he was cutting the hair of the white customers, a lot of times they were doing the business deal. So he was learning some of those lessons and almost like getting the Duke education without getting the Duke education because he was
Right.
hearing them work out on the deals, whether it was Mr. Duke and the Vanderbilts, Mr. Duke and the some of the Rothschilds, some of the other families of that particular time, and he was hearing how they were working out those deals and then bringing it
Mhm.
back to his own community, and they
Mhm.
created a very vibrant community here that existed until urban renewal came and kind of destroyed that community, and it's never been the same since and everything. But I'm just wondering,
Horrible. Yeah.
because that's a story that I know you've heard even in the Northeast as well, because this is not strictly a Southern story as well. So I
Oh,
was just wondering, one of the things that I loved about the title of your book is "Don't Buy the Bull," and we know that a lot of times people think about the bull, and that's actually the nickname for Durham, but they think about that in the sense of the bull economy or being that kind of robust economy. And I'm thinking that that's part of the reason that you gave it the title of "Don't Buy the Bull." So I was wondering if you could share that notion of why you came up with that title and some of the practical advice that you give on personal finances.
Sure. So it's funny because I wrote that book a number of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I originally wrote it as to be something kind of the antithesis of the personal finance gurus like Susie Orman. I felt that her base, let's call it thesis, right, for personal finance was too simplistic and did not give people enough tools that wanted to aspire to be something more than a 9 to 5 employee.
Right.
And so I wrote the book thinking, A, don't buy the bull, meaning bull poo poo. You can do what you want to do, right? The sky's the limit for anybody. If you want to be a small business owner, you can do it. And I went through in the book some ways that people can go to, banks, small banks, community banks, and get funding. And of course, then you're talking about the bull market as well.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But it's not always a bull market,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not always a good time to invest, even when you have a really good company that you like. It doesn't mean today is the day to put the money into it, right? So that's part of educating people about, uh, getting involved in investments.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the Vanderbilts.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard this really interesting story the other day, and it was comparing the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And now we've gone through several generations of when they were in their, glory days, I guess.
Right.
And very interestingly, the Rockefeller family is worth somewhere around $8 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And the Vanderbilt family, and I don't know where these numbers came from, but so they could be a little off, but the point is very self-evident. The Vanderbilt family only is worth about $1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is they didn't utilize
Right.
estate planning
Mm-hmm.
and trusts and all of the things that or available. And it's very sad, really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
And I think that the average person now, more than ever, has the ability through the internet to do more for themselves.
No, it's interesting you say that and everything, because one of the things that I know that my mom was involved in the trust fund business for a number of years and everything. She
Mhm.
was actually the first president of the Golden Belt Foundation, which was some of the tobacco settlement money. But before that,
Mhm.
she worked at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which of course is some of that Reynolds money
Yeah,
that came from the tobacco industry
right.
and all along those lines and everything. But to your point, a lot of times people were not thinking about setting up those funds, even some of those rich families like the Vanderbilts and all along those lines. I think one of the things that I mentioned to the people that I was talking to is that the fourth generation decided not to go into the newspaper field, and I kind of alluded to that in the opening monologue.
Mhm.
Actually, Lewis Austin had created the African American newspaper that was doing a lot of history, but was also serving as a kind of historical narrative
Mhm.
given kind of the history through the newspaper of what was going on at that time. And so a lot of the early civil rights stuff was documented at the Carolina Times, and a lot of other kind of historical things were documented. And then it went through, I think that was his daughter and granddaughter, but by the time it got to, I think it's the great grandson, he was not wanting to go into the business and everything in that space. So that business is now no longer around because the fourth generation, or maybe it was the third or fourth generation, decided that that wasn't the field for them. So that comes down to that whole conversation that I was kind of alluding to about generational wealth, and you kind of alluded to it as well, because it seems to me
Yeah,
that the Vanderbilts did not do a good enough job of maintaining their wealth, which is why they are at a lower wealth than, say, some of the other families that are more affluent, and they did like the Reynolds family did and set up those trust foundations. And even the Duke family had a couple of trust foundations as well that are still active, but some of these families did not do that.
absolutely. And it's a shame. And I think some of it does boil down to even the educational backgrounds of some of the folks in those families at that time.
Right.
The Vanderbilts, I think, unfortunately, in a way, there were more women in that family through the generations that they were not educated
Mm-hmm.
as the men were. And I think that contributed to some of the financial downfall, unfortunately. So, um, that's why I say nowadays there's really no excuse, right? We've pretty much all got the internet at our fingertips where we can ask any question and find firsthand information
Right.
about a topic, right? And that's something I believe very strongly in, is getting the information from the source. So it's not slanted in any way. Because I think there's a lot of that goes on, especially in the financial world. You've got folks out there that will sell you insurance and that tell you it's an investment.
Right.
No, it's insurance, right? So an annuity is not really an investment for most people, but they have nice big fees attached to them for the insurance agent. So when you start to read for yourself, you start to understand that there's a lot of bull out there, and you have to discern, what the reality is for yourself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like you said, there's a whole lot of that bull out there, and you have to decide how you're going to do that. I know one of the other things that people are very much fascinated by, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this as well, is the notion of how accessible not just the finances has become,
Mhm.
but also the computer technology. Because one of the things I was reading about you is that you just recently got your Python coding
Mhm.
certification and all in that space. And I know some people that are even learning about drone technology and learning about some of the coding that goes on in this space. And it seems like that has become easier than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago for folks to get certification, whether it's in Python or whether it's in one of the other kind of computer programs that exist. I was just wondering if you could
Yeah,
talk to our audience about the importance of technology and even some of this new technology and learning some of the coding aspects.
absolutely. I am a huge believer that every kid should be learning coding from as young as their parents, can tolerate, um, because it's going to be the basis for so many, I think, parts of life
Mhm.
in the next 20 years plus. As a 50 plus person, I decided that if I wanted to continue to grow and continue to learn, I had interns that I would ask them to do assignments and they would say, "Oh, I can do that in, well, let me just throw a couple lines of code together and I'll get back to you." And it would be something that it would have taken me hours to produce in the old fashioned, use an Excel spreadsheet and search
Mhm.
around. And within a half hour, they were giving me what I needed. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And I believe part of what I learned when I got my master's degree was if you're a good manager, you may not necessarily get in the trenches and do the actual work, but you know what all of your folks, you know, are doing, and you understand what they're doing so that you can know what's going on and manage it appropriately. So I decided that I probably needed to go learn how to do the Python coding just to understand what the power of it could be.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll tell you, it has been life changing for me. I honestly don't know how folks can be in the business world and want to continue to accelerate their careers and their financial future without having some idea of what this stuff is and how it works, because it's all, you can go online now and you can find free classes.
Mhm.
It's not, you don't have to spend any money, you don't have to leave your house, but you got to understand what this stuff can do and how power. In fact, I'm convinced that the idea that I had for firsthand research wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. There's no way, because the AI and the Python weren't as developed yet. And so also just the mere fact that I know what those concepts are and how they work, I knew that it was possible now to do. I didn't have to go ask somebody else to help me figure that out. I knew it was possible.
Yeah.
And
Speaking
so,
of things,
yeah.
yeah, and speaking of things that are possible and all along those lines, I've got a number of friends. Actually, the mayor here in Durham is a friend of mine, but he is also very much involved in the space of entrepreneurship and startup businesses because he is a educator, but he and his wife have opened up two, maybe even three, now that I think about it, restaurants that are kind of Zimbabwe influenced because she
Oh,
is
nice.
from originally from Zimbabwe, and he
Mhm.
grew up in rural North Carolina in all in that space. But I was just wondering because whether it was their restaurants or a number of other people that are trying to start up their various businesses, we know that it is not always as easy as people think it is to get startup capital and all along those lines. So, what advice would you give to folks that are one thinking about going down that entrepreneurial journey, and two trying to figure out how they can raise the capital to launch whatever their businesses are?
Yeah, well, I would say number one, restaurants are going to be the most difficult to get any sort of startup funding for. Banks will pretty much not give loans out to restaurants because it is such a high default rate. And, unfortunately, so, but look, there are a lot of folks that go into that space. They self fund, right? One of the things that I noticed in my career are the folks that start a company and they're using their own money are very cost conscious,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't go out and buy or rent some big office space that's fancy. They know how to bootstrap, which is really, I think, important. Um, the folks that get handed the financing, the funding, they tend to be the ones that, go get the big offices and the
Mm-hmm.
new furniture and hire 10 people right off the bat. And there's definitely something to be said about finding unique ways to fund a new business yourself, whether it's from your savings or listen, I think there's nothing wrong with using credit cards for
Mhm.
funding. I mean, it basically is a loan. It's a bank credit card. It's a loan. There's a big interest payment with it, but it's certainly a good way to start off. But also, I would say hire slowly.
Mhm.
Some people say, "Oh, I'm going to go hire an HR person. I'm going to hire, a sales manager and three salespeople." And you know what? Again, with the internet, you can outsource so much of startup business, so you can have a breather and not take on those kind of big commitments. That it makes things a lot easier. Now, of course, consumer tangible businesses like restaurants, that's a different issue.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that there's a way to do things now that don't require that you actually hire so many staff people right off the bat. You can use part-time workers, consultants, etc. And it's becomes much more cost effective.
No, not only that, but a lot of times one of the stops that we did during the tour is private in 1898, and that is a co-working space. That's actually where North Carolina Mutual used
Hmm.
to be and everything. But those can be a great way to lower
Absolutely.
some of your overhead as well,
Yeah.
because you have some of the access to everything from the internet to sometimes even some coffee and break rooms and conference
Right.
rooms and all in that space. And of course,
Yeah.
you're there with fellow entrepreneurs as
Hmm.
well. So that's just one. We also walked by American Underground, which is another one that exists and everything. So I'm a big fan of the co-working spaces that can be a great tool to help some of these early entrepreneurs because it can lower some of the overhead that you were just alluding
Absolutely.
to and
Yeah.
everything in that space. And I don't know that people are utilizing them as much as they probably should and everything because even that particular space when we got there a lot of the offices were empty not because they were empty but just because their tenants weren't there at the
Right.
particular time and everything. But they did look like they have a quite a few of the spaces that are occupied and being used on a consistent basis and everything. I just wanted your take on the overall nature of where we are as an economy and everything, because I know a lot of people, and not to get overly controversial, but it's like I said, it's my show, so I can do what I want to and everything. But I know some people are hearing the money that we're giving to certain countries and not saying that they don't deserve it because they are definitely under attack from different sources and everything. But then I know even here in Durham, and I'm sure you've seen it where you're at, and I think that if
Hmm.
I remember correctly, you're currently based in, I can't remember whether it's in the Northeast or in the Florida area and everything.
Hmm.
I'm sure you even see the homeless and all along those lines. Sometimes
Absolutely.
people are wondering how can we give money to help others when we have our own problems here. But I just wanted your take on where we are as a U.S. economy.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a lot of problems. uh, our government does not seem to want to turn the printing press off on the
Right.
money. This latest bill they passed over the weekend with the Ukraine funding again, like you said, I get it. You feel badly that there's a war going, but really, there's wars going on here. We
Right.
have the drug wars going on here. We have homelessness going on here. I mean, there's so many real problems in this. We still have people that don't have enough food to eat in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That we should be okay with turning our attention to halfway around the world. And look, this is again where the don't buy the bull comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody's feeding us lines of bull about our safety from halfway. Well, my safety actually in my own neighborhood uh, is not what it used to be, right?
Yeah.
So I would argue that um, we really have gotten out of hand. There's no accountability. And I think until there's accountability with the spending, one of those ways is Did you ever think about the fact that who audits the government spending?
Mhm. Well, well,
Think
even
about
speak, yeah,
it.
that's
It's a government agency that audits their spending. If you're
mm,
a public company like AT&T or Apple or you name it, you have to, by law, have an independent
auditor,
third party auditing firm come
right?
in and do an audit. So, why aren't we doing the same for our taxpayers? I mean, you and
Along
I,
that same line, because I hear where you're going with that, and along those same lines, one of the things that I would bring up is that no matter where you are in the United States and even around the world, there are a number of buildings that are popping up left and right. And one of the things that frustrates me, and I'm sure it frustrates you as well, is that while I don't knock the fact of the buildings going up, how many of them have less than 50% occupancy and all in that space? But it's a seen as a windfall, and eventually they may be a windfall if they actually are getting to that point where the tenants are coming in and the tenants are actually paying the people that are managing those office complexes or those apartment buildings and everything. But I can tell you right here in Durham, there are a number of them that are being constructed, and right now they are nowhere near full occupancy. And to me, that is a serious financial waste and everything along those lines. So I get that we need to have some new offices, but then the flip side of that is you got spaces that were not being occupied or not being used. I was actually just having this conversation with a friend of mine, and I was thinking about the fact that we've got some schools that had theater spaces, and those
mm-hmm,
theater spaces are not being used as theaters, even though the theater space is still there in the school or the old school, but it's not being used maximally. So I think that
right,
there's this notion that we aren't even maximizing the space that we have. Like I said,
right,
even during the pandemic, we sent a lot of the kids home, so they were doing as we were just talking about their homework and everything else on their computers at home, which meant that the classrooms weren't being used. And that to me is spaces that could be used for other things as well. But I don't know that the universities, whether that was Duke, whether that was Yale or wherever, we're thinking about things in that space enough and everything. Because I'm a
yeah,
big fan of reusing old buildings. Because one of the things we do here
right,
in Durham is the tobacco
mm-hmm,
warehouses are now apartments and their
right,
office complexes and all in that space. And I know they did similar things in the Northeast, like around New York and even down in Florida
yeah,
and all in that space. But I just wanted your
yeah.
take as to what we can do to make things better on that kind of like make it a stronger economy.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, well, I'd separate office buildings from uh, housing,
Right.
right? Because office buildings, I think we have had a structural economic change since COVID. People realized they don't need to have 3 floors of an office building when folks, can work remotely sometimes, right? Doesn't mean they can't come into the office and have to come in,
Right.
but they don't need to have a big corner office, right? They can use some flex space.
Right.
So there's definitely going to be a reckoning coming with the offices and whether or not I know there's companies out there working on this to see what can be done. Are they going to all get turned into housing? I don't know. But from a financing perspective, with the rates as high as they are, a lot of these buildings, they're going to come up on their refinance time limit. And there's going to be some big hit. I mean, look at San Francisco.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, they've got a lot of problems out there with homeless, drug abuse, and people aren't traveling there like they used to.
Right.
You've seen a couple of major hotels, literally the owners who have financing on them literally throw the keys back at the bank and say, here, you now own yourself
Mhm.
a hotel, because they can't seem to make the numbers ever work on them ever getting back, their return on investment. So they would rather just cut bait now. Um, that also leads to, you mentioned um, housing. I
Mhm.
was just reading that year over year, housing costs remain a huge problem, huge problem. Um, when you really delve into some of the numbers that were just put out on Friday, you've got 20 some percent year over year inflation still going on. That's really, really bad. And some of that is supply and demand in places where people are moving to,
Right.
right? Because again, due to COVID and a number of reasons, people are shifting around the country. And we have, before even COVID, not enough housing.
Mhm.
Now, um, the high interest rates are keeping people from moving. Those that have good mortgages are not willing to rock the boat because they've got something they can afford.
Right.
But this too is going to come to roost, and I don't think, we talk about, when are we going to turn the corner? Well, they're not going to lower interest rates until inflation is really under control. I think there's a higher possibility that interest rates could go up before the end of the year rather than down. And of course, they keep throwing these big Ukraine funding bills out there. That's just going to make things even worse.
And
We
how do
really
you think that's
have a
going to
lot.
impact a couple of things? How do you think that's going to impact because we've got an election that's going to come up and all along those lines. And I know
Mhm.
that a number of people have been concerned that we might be heading into a definite recession, even though all of the economic figures now seem to be positive that we are not heading into a recession. But then there are still some people that are putting out the notice that we could be heading to a depression at some point as well. But I just wondered, as one that studies the market on a regular basis, where do you think we are in terms of our health of the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar?
Yeah, I think that we've got problems with the US dollar. It's definitely being devalued, and rightly so. That's why you see the price of gold continuing to go higher. Um, Bitcoin, of course, which is kind of being viewed like gold in some respects because it's got a finite amount.
Mm-hmm.
That would also be another guidepost. So, really, when you delve into, they keep talking about the employment numbers and how strong the employment is. When you look under the hood, people have multiple jobs now to
Yes.
make ends meet.
Yes.
So the employment number may look good, but when you actually look at it, people are really struggling between the cost of food, the cost of gasoline,
Mm-hmm.
the cost of really the basics of living. People are needing to have multiple jobs. And that is a problem. And, I get very upset when I hear, and again, this goes back to my don't buy the bull again. I get very upset when I hear people say, oh, inflation's going down. No, 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 no. Inflation since 2020 has skyrocketed. It's only the rate of the change now from last year to this year that has slowed down. But let's say the eggs cost $1,
Mm-hmm.
right? In January or in June of 2020, they still cost $8 now, right? They just don't cost 9, but
Right.
they didn't fall back to 1.
Yeah.
So the paychecks haven't caught up.
Mhm.
They're not gonna, I don't think, unfortunately. And so they have no choice but to drive us into, I believe, a recession to break the supply and demand so these prices come down. But there's a lot of other factors out there. I mean, look at the number of accidents and plants that have burned, chicken factories, and uh, our food staples.
Mhm.
There's been so many accidents and fires and warehouses burned. I don't know. It's very strange to me. Nobody ever talks about that. But if you eliminate supply, of course the demand's going to, the price is going to go up because you don't have as much chickens around.
Yeah.
So nobody ever talks about that aspect.
No, they don't talk about that at all. So I'm glad that you're bringing that up and everything. One of the other things that I
Look
was,
it up.
yeah,
Look
but
it up.
yeah, definitely I'm going to look it up and check it in because that's a legitimate question and a legitimate thought and everything in that space. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I was involved to some degree with Occupy when that was taking place, and I know that there was a whole conversation around those that are in the top 1% and versus those that are in the bottom 10% and all along. And a lot of times people talk about how the middle is totally getting squeezed out of that conversation, even in this particular day. But I just wondered your take, because even I've got some friends that are involved, and actually next week will be the May Day celebration, which is actually a Labor Day celebration, even though a lot of people would get that that was one of the
Mhm.
original Labor Days as opposed to the one that we celebrate in September and all in that space. But there are a number of people that are trying to get, a certain base salary that exists for even for our factory workers and our
Mhm.
workers in the food industry and even some of those in the hospital space. I was just wondering your thoughts around people that are trying to get in certain jobs to get up to 15 or $20 an hour, which in a lot of cases even isn't even really that much of
Right.
a livable wage and everything. But I just
Right.
wondered your take on this idea of trying to increase certain pay rates up.
Well, I'll tell you, um, I think that I keep hearing something which I find very distressing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that is that the rationale for letting all these folks in illegally at the southern border
Mm-hmm.
is because we don't have enough people, we don't have enough labor force, right, to go work in the hospital, in the chicken factory,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I hear that and I say, wow. In other words, they're using that as a mechanism to control the economy. So, no, you're not going to get that labor rate up to 15 or $20 an hour as long as there's somebody coming from, a depressed third world that's willing to work for 7.
Yeah.
So, I have to say that really we want to see all that stopped and we want to see our own folks making a proper living. We need to really look at things like that. Everything boils down to supply and demand, right?
Yeah, and yeah,
And
definitely. But even in that space, how do we get people? Because one of the arguments I've heard is that some of those jobs, whether it's jobs that are taken on by our Latin American folks, or whether it's jobs taken on by other cultures that come, because there are even some people from Eastern Europe and from some
mhm,
of the African
mhm,
nations, as well as jobs that quote unquote people that are born here don't necessarily want to do and won't do even if you offer them the job. Because I've heard a number of people be like, no, you can give me that janitorial job and I'm probably not going to do it, or that job in the hotel and everything. But as I oftentimes say, even about vocational training, because I actually had some relatives
right.
who were in
Yeah.
vocational fields and everything, some of those
Mhm.
people actually do better than the ones that are supposed to be the
Absolutely.
most well to do. Because I had some
That's
family
right.
members that were plumbers, and I have some friends
Mhm,
that are truck drivers, and I definitely know that some of them make more than some of my doctor and lawyer
mhm.
friends. But
That's
a lot of
absolutely
times
right.
we don't want to think about that fact that they can even make some
Yeah.
great revenue. And even in not the talk that I did today, but the talk that I did on last Wednesday, there was a lady that was part of that panel, and she was talking about how we oftentimes get confused about status because there's this stereotype of the black welfare queen, even though I hate to say it, but a lot of times there's a lot of European women that are also on
Mhm,
welfare as
mhm.
well. And a lot of times there is also the notion of if just because your status symbol isn't the same as my status symbol doesn't mean that the status symbols have less importance. So maybe in my culture, the status symbol is a sneaker, and maybe in
Right,
yours, it's a car and
right,
everything. It doesn't
right,
mean that it's not
right.
downgrading the fact of the status symbol. It's still a status symbol, but and
Yeah.
everything. But we do some of this downgrading within the status symbol conversation as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I agree with you that we have been so, again, don't buy the bull. We have been so ingrained and brainwashed into being so consumer driven
Hmm.
that, does, is having a TV in every room absolutely necessary? No. But, again, that's part of the, let's call it, circle of, or the consumer driven economy that we are all on the hamster wheel of. And until we start to realize that and discern for ourselves that's what's going on, right? It's going to continue. So I would say that you're right. I mean, there's people from all different, walks of life that are. I don't think it's a color thing. I think it's a mentality thing.
Right.
It's a ancestral thing,
Hmm.
right? What kind of, people look at their roots and grandmothers, great grand, what were they taught? And that progresses through. My family's from Greece. My mother's first generation. They all came here as a family. She started working when she was 14 years old. And, that's what I saw, right? That's what I saw. Uh, Education, that's going to get you somewhere, right? But I believe that the skilled labor is highly, highly uh, needed more of, and a very respect. I mean, if I don't have kids, but I always say if I had kids, I'd be telling them to go learn how to be a plumber or electrician, or go learn the coding. It wouldn't be to go spend $100,000 on college.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that makes a
Um,
lot of sense because I don't have any kids of my own either. I've actually got my two nephews, and they are definitely very much into that technology space. They have their Oculus sets that they use on a regular basis, and I have some friends that are very much into the metaverse space that are younger because I'm in my early 60s, but they are like some of my friends are in their 40s and 50s, and they definitely have looked at that notion of the importance even of the metaverse and all along those lines. And I know one of the things that you talk about, which is kind of tied into that and all along those lines, is this notion because some people hear the term but don't even know what it is. But I have
mhm.
definitely aware of it and actually understand that there was even one of the Trumps that was selling their necklace using it, and all along those lines. It might have been Melania, but a lot of times people hear about the NFTs and they're going like, well, what exactly
Oh
is
yeah.
a non-fungible token and how can
Mhm,
I use that as part of this decentralized financing, which you've kind of been alluding to as
mhm,
well. 'Cause I know a lot of people are interested in NFTs and they might
mhm,
even have some NFTs, but then they're
mhm.
not sure as to how to make it worthwhile for their investments.
Yeah, I don't think it's an investment. In my mind, the NFTs, these tokens,
Mhm.
are a function of being on the blockchain. And basically, what sets them apart from Bitcoin is the fact that a token is basically a contract, a digital contract,
Mhm.
right? So, literally, let's say I want to go buy my house,
Yeah.
and I put 20% down. All the terms of the purchase can be put on an NFT. Here's the purchase price. Here's the dollar amount needed for the closing. Here's the names of the people. And when all of those things are done, the funds are released because it's all on that token, right? So it has a real utility.
Mhm.
This business of the NFTs being an investment, like the digital art, yeah,
Right.
that's kind of cute. I mean, I think the people that were willing to pay millions of dollars for some of this stuff are nuts. But
Well,
and
no, I agree with you because I never did quite understand
yeah,
the board apes and some of the other ones. And
yeah,
my dad is actually a fairly well known artist here in our local community, but even up and down the East Coast, he's got some reputation. And I've got other friends that are artists of note and everything, and I'm sitting there going like that I understand, but then
right.
like you said, uh, art can be in the eye of the beholder and all in that space.
Right.
Because I didn't quite get, even though you were there in New York, and maybe even at the time that
Mhm.
it was big and everything, I never quite understood the whole Andy Warhol. It's basically a soup can. Last time I checked, it looked like a soup can. It acts like a soup can. It's still a soup can and everything. But he did make millions off of those soup can
Right, right.
pictures and all along those lines. So I do know
Yeah.
that art can oftentimes be in the eye of the
Eye
beholder.
of the
Because I've even known
beholder
some
for
people that
sure.
have
Yeah.
done some trash type of art where they've literally gone and picked some
Right.
item from the trash can and then turned it
Yeah.
into some fashion of art and all along those lines. So definitely the what people are willing to pay for and invest in as their art investment can be an interesting conversation as well. So definitely there are some things that I just admire totally. And I'm like, yes, I get it. I get why you might pay $1,000 for it. But I also know, as you know, that sometimes artists will also inflate their prices because sometimes they don't want to sell it and sometimes they want
Right.
to keep it in their own personal
Yeah.
collection. So I have known some artists that have intentionally overpriced their art because they,
Right.
in a lot of ways, had no intention of selling it.
Mhm. Yeah, I have an uncle like that actually. So, uh, no, it's very true. But the underlying value in the NFTs is really in the way it can be used, and it's going to happen. You're not, you know how you can worry about your title of your house being stolen from you because somebody can go to the county and write a quit claim deed and boom, they own the house.
But
Uh, that will all go away with the use of the blockchain and the NFTs. Your title will be held on a token. So there's going to be the tokenization of assets, right? Even the stock market. Right now, when you buy a share of stock, it takes a couple of days for that trade to actually settle. That's going to become instantaneous
well,
because of the tokenization. Oh, there won't be stock certificates anymore, right? There won't be as many people involved in the whole process of settling a trade from the buyer to the seller. It's going to happen instantaneously. That's where everything's going. And it's happening fast. It's within the next couple of years. I think all of this, even car.
hold on a second. I got to back up on that. So
Mhm.
one of the great stereotypes, I mean, there were entire movies made about it, like Wall Street and a number of others, is this notion of the stock exchange, whether it's the New York Stock Exchange, whether it's the Tokyo Exchange, whether it's a number of these other things that exist. And of course, there are people that have, there's that stereotype of the people running around making these business deals and trying to make these business deals and all along those lines. But if I'm hearing you correctly, you are predicting as one that follows the trends and everything that might be less of an actual physical location. So maybe we won't have a New York Stock Exchange or a Tokyo Stock Exchange, and that it might be done more in a computer kind of time frame and not so much that kind of the traditional ways that we heard about for decades, if not centuries, and all along those lines.
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but it's already happening on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. All those folks that are working there are basically there for the most part as backup. A lot of this is all happening computerized anyway,
Okay.
and they're there in case there's a glitch. So, yeah, that's
So
basically where things are going.
and that's across the board because I know that even a number of restaurants, and I know people are getting frustrated about this, but there is the notion that you might not have to be worried about your rude bank teller or your rude
Right?
restaurant teller and everything, because eventually when you go there, you will be greeted by a robot that
Yeah.
may or may not be sentient and that may answer the question for you as to whatever your order is and all along those lines. So I'm not sure how I'm quite feeling about that notion of giving my order to a robot, but I do understand that that is going to be very much the trend right now. I go to a couple of nearby restaurants and I'm glad to have conversations with the people that I have gotten to know, but I think that that might be a thing of the museums in a little bit of our future. But I just wonder your take
Yeah.
on that because I'm hearing more and more people talk about this notion that one of the trends that we're going to see economically is more and more things becoming overly computerized.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's gonna. In fact, I was just talking to a friend of mine. Her husband owns a factory that makes steel. um, trash bins,
Hmm.
and he has welders that work for him, but they like to have 8-hour days. When he has more demand, even if he offers them more money, they don't want it because they want to go home, go fishing, be with their family, whatever. So he just bought two robots. And yes, it's taken a little bit of time to tweak them to get them to work exactly as needed on, in whatever capacity in the production line. But now that he has that, he can do what he needs to do to fulfill his orders, right? He didn't have to hire more people. He didn't have to pay a lot more to the welders. So yes, this is going to become more and more a trend. That's why I keep saying folks need to learn how to code
Yeah, they definitely got to learn how to code. But
because
even speaking
and
of that, but even speaking of those trends, because right now one of the other jobs, because I was actually doing that even while we're doing the interview and all along those lines, is I have worked for a testing company. It is a leading testing company, and all along those lines. And I know that while there are people that are glad at what is going on, we do a lot of the going online, but we can also do it even in the nature of being able to have flexible hours and all along those lines. So I think that
Mhm.
that's something else that we're going to see even more of, particularly in companies that allow it and everything. So even to the point that if you're not able to, for whatever reasons, hire the robot to do the work, that you're going to see a lot more companies that are doing kind of what uh, Measurement and some of the other companies that are doing, which is saying that, yeah, you can work as long as you make your 8 hours or whatever
Mhm.
the amount of hours, you can do it anytime between, say, 7
Right.
and midnight or 7 and 2,
Yeah.
but you pretty much get to set your own hours because they know
Mhm.
that even us as humans are oftentimes having to do multiple things. If you've got kids, and I know that we both said we don't, but if you've got kids, you got
Mhm.
to run out and take care of the kids, or maybe go to their
Mhm.
basketball games, or you got to do other things, even in terms of your social life and all along those lines. So I think more
Mhm.
and more companies are going to be doing these what I call super flex hours and all along those lines. But as a
Right.
person that studies the economy and things in that space, because I'm also fascinated, even here locally in Durham and in the what we call the Research Triangle Park, there are a number of
Mhm.
home amenities that are brought to some of these companies. Like I know
Right.
SAS
Right.
has like some spaces, like some play spaces that some of the workers can go to, and then they have different other things that try to make the
Mhm.
workplace family friendly, for lack of
Right.
a better term, and
Yeah.
everything. But I just wonder, is that another trend that we're going to see in terms of the betterment of our economy and everything? Because that's something that I've been observing over the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that whole, let's put a game room in the office comes and goes. That's been going on the last 25 years. I think they're somewhat tied to where we are in the economy. And when they need to cut costs, that's going to be one of the first places they go to before they start laying off people. But, um, here's an interesting and probably not very well known fact. The DuPont company,
Mm-hmm.
way back in the early 1900s. They were not only DuPont, which made chemicals and gunpowder, paint, they owned the majority of GM as
Mm-hmm.
well. And they were trying to figure out how to grow their revenues
Right,
because the
right.
world wasn't as global as it is now with trading partners. It was basically the United States. So their think tank came up with the concept of people used to work 6 days a week.
Right.
So they came up with the idea of we're going to give people the weekend off.
Mm-hmm.
And if we give people the weekend off and they have more free time to spend with family, that means they also have more time to go out and spend money
Right.
and be a consumer. So yeah, that's how they got more cars sold because people now could go out Sunday driving. There's a whole
But
real
didn't it also create an entire business that unfortunately is not as popular as it used to be, even though there are new variations of it. But around that same time, isn't that when malls became very popular because we wanted to drive people to spend that money that they made over the weekend to go to the family mall? Because, like I said, we have a big mall here in Durham called South Point, which still exists, but the other two that were more family oriented and more
Mhm.
smaller malls, South Square and Northgate, are no longer. As a matter of fact, Northgate is the one that left more recently, I think right before the pandemic, and everything South Square has been gone for a while, and now they're building like the box store kind of things, like the Sam's
Right.
and things of that nature. But I
Yeah.
do remember that the malls used to be very popular, and even high school kids and to some degree college kids would go there because, like
Right.
your gaming point, there were game rooms and decent restaurants, and of course there was no matter your orientation, there was a lot of flirtation that was going on as well. So it kind of became, I hate to use the term, but a pickup spot, and I'm sure that exists in
Right.
Florida and New York as well.
Well, what I would say is malls, the modern day mall, really got started in the 1960s.
Right.
Uh, you know, several decades after the work, we changed the introduction of air condition to
Mm-hmm.
the modern day mall by Albert Taubman, um, who really was the inventor of the modern mall. Really changed the dynamics and also contributed greatly to the lack of the moving of folks out of cities into more suburban areas, right? uh, One of the big differences between the Northeast and obviously the South is that the Northeast was basically built before the automobile,
Mm-hmm.
right? So everything's more compact. You have train systems. Now they need all be upgraded, but there was more infrastructure there in that way. But once the automobile came around and people could drive, there became this, sprawl movement, and folks moved out in the cities, and you saw, some of that urban plight start from there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would say that uh, I hear people talk about, well, now we're going to go to a 4-day work week,
Yeah, I've heard that conversation.
right? And I think that's going to have some very big pros and cons. I know they've been testing it out, and there's a lot of positives with it. Um, maybe less stress, things of that nature. I don't know, but the flip side is now there's another day for folks to be even more of a consumer. so, it's interesting when you look at things from a different angle. How a little bit of that bull starts to pop up in there.
Yeah, speaking of that bull and all along those lines, I know that sometimes people are fascinated by why things are created. Because one of the things that I just kind of alluded to with I was talking to the ladies earlier today, and it was just a illusion because I didn't get to go into depth the way I'm going to with you and everything. But there is a very popular aspirin that existed and it was created in Durham and everything. That's BC powder, and part of it because back then it was also called production powder because of that, whether it was the tobacco plant or some of the other plants, those were hot and noisy environments. So the
Mhm,
pharmacists had to find something that could relieve that pain and all along
mhm,
those lines. So actually, it was one of my other jobs, the Arts Council. The building that was nearby there is literally where they created that aspirin at a
mhm.
pharmacy and all along those lines. So they were
Wow.
distributing the free samples to people that they believe would be repeat customers, as a lot of those people that were working, like I said, in textile mills, other manufacturing mills, and the farms and the railroads. So they definitely created that whole notion of creating that powder and then selling it to them, even during the tobacco boom. So it was a gentleman
Mhm,
named Germaine Bernard and Commodore Council that created it way back in 1906. So we're talking over 100 years ago that they
mhm,
created that aspirin that people even use to this particular day and everything. So that's one of them
mhm.
cases of mother being what's that necessity being the mother of
Necessity,
invention.
right, right, yeah.
So they saw that there was a need for
Uh-huh.
it and created it, and like I said, it's gone on to sponsor even one of our other uh, Maine, North Carolina mainstays, because you'll see BC Powder being a sponsor both of country music, amateur baseball, and of course the NASCAR as well. Because definitely that is a North Carolina tradition also. So we've
Hmm.
got local folks like Tracy Atkins and
Hmm.
Richard Petty that have even still to this day gone in there and been supporters of that whole particular form of aspirin and all in that space.
Hmm.
But that was based here. Like I said, it was one of them cases of
Hmm.
mother being, I mean, necessity being the mother of invention.
Yeah, exactly.
What are some of the things that you think that people need to be paying attention to? Because, like I said, the network is very big on fiscal responsibility and us being, and you kind of alluded to it with the folks needing to know Python and computers. And if you had kids, that's what you'd be teaching them. And I'm
Hmm.
sure you'd also be giving them ways to do their finances. Like I used to belong and try to follow my own spending on Mint and all along those lines. Sometimes it can be very frustrating because then you learn that you're spending more money than you need to on things, because I mean I know that there are certain percentages. Like I think it's supposed to be 20 or 25% is supposed to go to your housing, but then if you look at it, you might find that you're spending 20 to 25% on your foods, because a lot of times we unfortunately eat out way too often. And some of
Hmm.
that is the busyness of our lifestyles and all in that space. But I just wondering,
Hmm.
what are some of the things that you wish would be taught more often to folks in general, whether they're kids or whether they're even our adults as well? Because I can tell you, when I had, I don't have that program now, but when I had men and I still use Acorn and some of the other ones, I
Hmm.
even personally get frustrated with some of the things and kind of chastise myself and then
Hmm.
go back into the old habits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the earlier we start, the better, right? So the good habits start young, but you know, I think good old fashioned home economics needs to be taught.
Yes.
Uh, you mentioned the cost of housing being around 25%. Well, for a lot of people now, right now, that's not a possibility.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised right now for a lot of people if they can't save,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unfortunately, but I had very early in my career, uh, I worked with a very old stockbroker,
Mm-hmm.
and he gave me a very good piece of advice. I was, new to getting a paycheck and having a 401k to put money into. And he said to me, think about what your fixed expenses are for your rent,
Right.
insurance, all that. And he said, then think about how much you think you can put in to your 401k. And he said, and then put a little more in
Mm-hmm.
so that it hurts. Because if you do that, you'll be very happy because the earlier you start, it's those early years, that time value that's going to really make the difference by the time you're retired. And I did that. I did take that advice. Never missed it, because it wasn't like I was using it before. So I would say that's a very big thing. People don't take advantage enough of their 401k and the matching that the companies they work for as a perk will give them for free. That's free money.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very important part of fiscal, uh, individual fiscal responsibility, I think. Because the reality is, Social Security is not going to truly be there for us. In the next couple of years, the amounts for people that are um, going to retire, they're not going to get paid out what they were supposed to, because we haven't done, Congress again has not done what it's supposed to. And these entitlement programs, and they're important, not saying they're not, but they haven't addressed other parts of the budget to cut enough that we can sustain these important entitlement programs that you and I have paid into, right?
Right.
So, um, no, they don't want to do the right things because they don't want to not get reelected. But unfortunately, um, Somebody's got to make the hard decisions and take one for the team being us, the people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but along those same lines and everything, because I know one of the things that you're very passionate about, and I kind of alluded to it on some of the other talking points and all in that space, is this notion of, and you kind of alluded to it even in that notion of what we can do with entitlements, is the notion of civil liberties. And I do know that a lot
Hmm.
of people are thinking about the divisiveness that is going on in our
Hmm.
community. You kind of even
Hmm.
alluded to that when you're talking about the immigrants and all of along those
Hmm.
lines. I just wanted your thoughts around how are we doing as a country with civil liberties, and do you think that we can do better in that regards, and what can we do better to get out of this divisive nature that we seem to have throughout the country, and that's been going on, I would argue, for decades and all along those lines. But I just wanted your space and your thoughts on civil liberties, because I know it seems like a lot of women's rights are being taken away. It seems like
Hmm.
a lot of LGBT rights are being taken
Hmm.
away, or at least trying to be taken away. So I just wanted your take on what we can do as a society to make sure that we are taking care of the least of us, as well as just doing good in general.
Hmm. Well, I would say that what you and I were taught in school about in civics class or history class, and how the judicial system is supposed to work, again, bull. It doesn't really work like that for most of us.
Right.
Um, the fact is that we are supposed to have these constitutional amendments that are hard and fast and not to be touched. First Amendment being one of them, um, but all the way down the line, religious freedom,
Mm-hmm.
freedom from uh, undue or process. And the fact is that I think we, the American people, have been so preoccupied with consumerism and having fun that we've not paid attention to the creep of regulatory government
Mm-hmm.
that has basically, that's really what governs us now more than anything. I'll give you an example. I have to buy a fishing permit if I want to go fish. I don't know about you,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm pretty sure you do in North Carolina.
Yes, we do.
If I want to drive on the beach, I have to have a permit.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to fish from the shoreline, well, last I checked, when the pilgrims got here, they didn't have to have a permit to go fish, to get fish out of the water to feed their family,
Right.
right? All of those little things, while on the face value, that seems like not a big deal, but add all of that up and it becomes a big oversight of government in
Mm-hmm.
every aspect of our life. So I would say that you're right. This has been many decades. I am, I think the LGBT thing is sort of, um, I think they've gotten, we have marriage equality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's enough. And maybe that's controversial to some, but I can say it because I'm part of that community. And I think that no one that I know is threatening to take away my right to marry, right?
Right.
If I want to pay taxes as a married couple, I can do that. Um, what I take issue with right now is the Title IX. The women worked so hard to have equality in so many ways, and it is very disturbing to see how um, you know the notion of, and I don't even really think there's a very large population out there,
Mhm.
But the notion of these transgender athletes, right, should be forced their way into women's sports, um, is a major disrespect of girls and women.
Right.
Uh, I feel strongly about that. I was an athlete growing up. I played tennis. I worked my butt off. And if I had to go out and then compete about, a teenage boy that decided he wanted to be a girl, I would have never won another match. And I would have had such low self esteem. And it would have been so damaging, I think. And so, that's, I think, a really unfortunate problem. And I think it boils down to people just using their common sense,
Mhm.
right? You can't be afraid to have those conversations. And trust me, I mean, I've had the conversations with other people in the gay community. They don't like to hear sometimes the common sense, right? Because they live in their own little worlds. But we have to respect the fact that, even if you look at LGB
Mhm.
and then they say T, LGB is sexual preference.
Right.
It has nothing to do with you wanting to be a different gender.
Mhm.
Gender identity and sexual identity are two different things. And I feel like they've kind of tried to hijack the whole LGB movement, right? Which, again, those folks, they protested down the street in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Till we got to where we are now. And I feel,
It's interesting you say that because that's actually one of the complaints, and I'm not saying it's a legitimate complaint, but it's definitely one that I've heard from the African American community where they sometimes felt that they were hijacked by the LGBT community and some of the other communities as well and everything. So I definitely think that there can be some allyship and some groups that can work together. And definitely I think that AIM, which is American Indian Movement, and some of the Black nationalists work together, and definitely even some of the folks that worked even with Reverend Barber that were part of the LGBT community and everything. But I do remember that that was one of the complaints that was given in the early days of the civil rights, was that there was this
mhm,
notion that it was being hijacked, kind of the way you're thinking that the trans movement is hijacking the LGBT movement. But there was some of that similar conversation that I remember hearing, not so much in my peer group, but definitely in my
mhm,
dad's peer group and all in that space. So it seems like that notion that history can sometimes come full circle, because that's a, as you were saying, that I was going like, I've heard that argument before, but I've heard
mhm,
it from a different part of
right,
society and all
right.
along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if everyone would look at the fact that we're all Americans and we all have come here from somewhere else.
Right.
Our history didn't start here. No one's did unless we're, Native American.
Right.
Um, but this country was founded on the principles of not wanting to live under a king,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being able to speak your mind, right? Um, and basically live how you want to live.
Right.
We all want those things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that our media is very divisive in a lot of ways. I think that it's structured that way, and when you actually get your head out of the TV and the movies and all that, and you actually interact in the world, you actually realize that there's a lot less negativity out there in person than what you're told there is. And I personally am, fighting against my First Amendment rights being gagged right now, because I settled a lawsuit with the federal government rather than bankrupt myself by going um, into a battle in the courtroom. and I can't talk about what happened to me at all.
Well,
I can't admit or deny anything that was in their original lawsuit complaint against me.
mm,
So, but yet, if I went to jail and I came out of jail, I could write a book.
right.
So there are serious issues with our civil liberties. Fortunately, there are really good nonprofits out there fighting for us all.
Yeah.
Um, I don't, again, they don't talk about it on TV, all
No,
of the ways in
yeah,
which,
'cause I'm actually get emails regularly from one of the gentlemen that was involved with the Move movement and definitely created prison radio. So he actually talks
Mhm,
about a lot of prison reform that goes on, not just in the prison that he's at, which I believe is up there in the Philadelphia area and
mhm,
all along those lines, because I know that's where Move was, but I can't remember that.
mhm. Yeah, I remember that.
But
Yeah.
definitely, but yeah, that gentleman is create one of the creators of prison radio, and there are folks that are doing some great work in that space of prison reform, because the prison system and actually the entire, and as a past lawyer, you probably can agree with me, the entire legal system probably needs a
Absolutely.
revamping and all along those lines, because it's got some serious problems. Because I don't, I find it hard to believe, and I'm not saying that one group cannot be more criminally inclined than
Mhm,
another, but I just
mhm.
find it very disheartening that the majority of the prisoners around the country are black and brown, and that just tells me that certain other communities have greater access to lawyers and greater financial resources that other communities may not have, and all in
Yeah.
that space. So
Yeah, I
that's
would say definitely, those that have the financial resources
okay.
have a better shot at keeping themselves out of jail. Whether
Mhm.
or not they're guilty or not is a different story, right?
Right.
Um, but the drug issue is
Mhm.
so bad, and I think that's why our prisons are, a lot of it is drug related.
Mhm.
And again, if we could tackle that, we would see, I think, a lot less recidivism.
Right.
Um, I've got friends that have family that have been in and out of jail
Mhm.
because of heroin over the course of, the last 10 years. It's very sad. Um, the other thing is that,
Well,
you
it
know,
even comes down to something else that you mentioned earlier, which is that notion of family and the importance of family. Because the other thing that my younger brother works at, and I hate using the term because sometimes I think that we use certain terms that we do that whole notion of a self fulfilling prophecy and
Mhm,
everything. So we'll use the term, and I've used it before because it is the standard term. But if we call kids at risk, then we are probably making them at risk because we're already giving them that notion that they are at risk. But that whole gang notion, because of my understanding, I do have some friends that were in gangs and some other friends that were
mhm,
involved in gang reform, kind of like what my brother is doing, getting kids out of the gangs and all in
mhm,
that space. Is a lot of times what they're looking for is a sense of family, or that
mhm.
they're not getting from their own regular family structure and everything. So sometimes they would join the
Yeah.
gangs, and that whole gang and gun violence, which is another very important issue that we're dealing with in the United States and around the world, is people that are trying to find their place because they don't have their place at home. Because one of the other shows we do here on the network is called Where's the Love? They just did it yesterday. That Stephanie Hockenall in Kansas and her son Gene, but they talk about one of the other pandemics, and I agree with them because I usually write the description of their show is the pandemic of bullying, and you kind of alluded to it even with your law case and everything, because there is a
Mhm,
serious pandemic of bullying that is going on both in the corporate
mhm.
world as well as the school system and a number of other places as well. And I think that that might even be a greater health risk than the actual pandemic that we just came out of and all along those lines. But I don't know what your take on that notion is of how much we've got to help our kids get out of the gangs and also fight against this epidemic of bullying.
Absolutely. And I think that, and I don't know, you probably have better statistics on this than I do. I know that up until right after World War II, the marriage rate, right,
Mm-hmm.
between folks of any color
Mm-hmm.
was the same,
Right.
right? And somewhere uh, in the, I guess, early 60s, it started to veer. where the marriage rate in the, I guess, really the African American community started to drop, and you saw, unfortunately, as a result of that, I believe, um, a lot of single moms,
Mhm.
no dad really around to be that father figure. I don't care what you say, there is, we are two different genders, and there is value in a father and a mother figure teaching their children, two different things, right? And I think that a lot of that is what where we're at now is the effect of that over the last couple of decades.
I could definitely see that. And the other thing that has frustrated me to some degree is, and I kind of alluded to it to the ladies when I did that presentation earlier this morning, is um, there's also a lot of hypocrisy that exists in some of our spiritual leaders as well, and all in that space. So that's why I also get frustrated, because I know a number of friends of mine, including some that were going through homelessness, and they would reach out to their
Mhm.
church family or their church
Mhm.
friends, because they didn't always attend the churches, and a lot of times they were given a cold shoulder or a "we can't help you" kind of attitude. And last time
Mhm.
I checked, I thought that was one of the tenets of most religions, not just Christianity, but most religions in general, would to help the least of these. So if you can't help the
Right.
least of these, how much can you really be doing God's work in the true sense of the word and everything? So that is also another thing that I get frustrated
Yeah.
by, as well as there's a lot of people that aren't doing the work that they should and could be doing in that space.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there before the grace of God go I, right?
Right.
And um, I believe very strongly in that. Um, the problem, I think, is that the government may have gotten too involved, in a lot of ways, and there's certain, let's call it, maybe religious edicts,
Mm-hmm.
aren't allowed to mix with government. So, I think that's hurt. Having some religion isn't a bad thing, right? Or some spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
uh, for sure.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
also think that we've got, kind of circling back to the discussion about the prisons,
Mm-hmm.
we've got folks sitting in there that are perfectly capable of learning and working. And yet, as far as I know, there's not a whole heck of a lot of true education going on in the prisons to prepare people for when they go back into the real world, particularly for women,
Right.
in prisons. And I feel very strongly that, that needs to change, because um, a lot of these folks end up back in the same communities with the same people, et cetera, and they really need to be given a fresh start, which includes having the skills to support themselves without maybe resulting to doing things that are illegal.
Yeah. I can definitely agree with you on that and everything. And there are some great cases of people that basically self-taught themselves while they're in
Mhm.
prison. Malcolm X comes to mind automatically, but there are others as well and everything. But yeah, definitely, there's probably not enough of that. I do know that here in the Carolinas, there are still some people that are learning skills in the prison, whether that's the chain gang kind of stuff that goes on with them doing road repairs and things along those lines, or some of the other things that take place in that space. But and they are learning some skills, because I do know some people that have gone in there to try to teach different courses and everything. But there probably should be a lot more done, and
Mhm.
definitely done in that space with the women prisoners and all along those lines. Because we also know that there is a great deal of probably abuse that goes on in that system as well. Because it is, unfortunately, as most of society is very patriarchal and everything in that space, and that is also problematic as well and everything, because that's just in general. One of the things I was really shocked by, even, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this, is when I looked at the places that you've been on in the past. You have been on some very great spaces that cover the spectrum. Because definitely, when I think of CNBC and Fox, they are definitely on one side, maybe one more liberal and the other more conservative. But I was
Mhm.
just wondering how you found it maintaining that space, even talking about finances in different spaces that are uh, diametrically opposed. I'll just leave it at that with everything.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is when it comes to money, right?
Uh-huh.
Money doesn't know the color of somebody's skin, right? Or what gender they are. It's completely a level playing field. So when I talk about investing and money, I'm pragmatic about it and completely agnostic to, um, what somebody's political views are. All I care about is what's the economy, what's the global economy, and how does that translate into now, in the intermediate, and in the long term for my pocketbook.
Right.
And I really try and separate that out from the politics. Um, so I guess for me, the other thing is, you know, I think the older we get more wise just because we've been around
Right.
longer, have more experiences. And again, this is where I go back to we're all Americans, and there are certain things that we all can agree on. And, um, I think that, uh, we'll even take just, the issues surrounding police brutality, for
Mhm.
example.
Okay.
I don't think most people really believe that we should not have police.
Yeah, I mean that's
Um,
one of the great misnomers of terminology because
right,
the whole notion of defunding the police, they did um, not saying to get rid of the police altogether. Most of them, they're mostly just trying to, as you just kind of alluded to, make sure that the police aren't being abusing their power.
right, exactly. And I think that um, the abuse of power definitely, it gets highlighted a lot more in the media against, certain groups.
Hmm.
But I think they're actually equal opportunity abusers of their power. And it's a function of the job.
Yeah.
Um, I think that they should be evaluated psychologically every year. And
Mhm.
at some point, they probably need to be rotated off, right? Because that's, I guess, if I were going to walk down the street every day with a gun, and there's that, mentality of I'm the boss, right? And B, the mentality of I could be shot any minute. I think that would play some psychological games on me. So nobody ever talks about that. I mean, they talk
They don't
about,
talk about that, and one of the things they do talk about is this notion that a lot of times, and you kind of alluded to that as well, is that they are not prepared to deal with every situation. Because I know here we've got a group of folks that are more trained in the mental health that goes on, and all along those lines. I think the group is not called health, but it's got H in the heart, and that they will be people that are trained in how to deal with domestic disputes, how to deal with
Mhm.
mental disputes and everything, because unfortunately the police are not always trained into that notion. So they need to have somebody there that is able to break down those situations, that is actually being trained in that area and all along those lines, because that's something that a lot of police are not prepared for. And I know for a fact, because I've had some friends that have been involved in that space, that a lot of times they have no clue what to do when they get into those domestic disputes and all in
Yeah.
that space. So if you've got somebody that is actually trained in conflict resolution, and then you can be there as a police officer to make sure that things don't escalate into a violent situation, then
Right.
that can be a better situation because they are actually trained in how to deal with that conflict, whether it's around family dynamics or
Mhm.
relationship dynamics or
Yeah,
a number of other dynamics that they are not physically trained in.
that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe one day we'll get some enhancements in that area.
Yeah, we definitely need some enhancements in that area for sure and everything. As we're going to wind down shortly and everything, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Got to get you to come
Yeah.
back on some other shows as
Hmm.
well and everything. But one of the things that I was curious about, and we still got a few more minutes to go, is
Hmm.
what advice would you give to people that are thinking they want to invest? I mentioned that Sasha Starr, who is of Ukrainian descent and from currently living in Canada, is a big investor in NVIDIA. As a matter of fact, he and his wife just came back from Aruba, and he jokingly called it his NVIDIA vacation because he made the
Mm.
money off of NVIDIA and was able to go down to Aruba and everything. But I know other people are
Mhm.
looking at things that they don't want to invest in. Like apparently you don't want to invest in the Bronco because apparently the Bronco got some negative publicity, both because of OJ's passing and the fact that they just got recalled and all along those lines. And I don't know that you necessarily want to be investing in Tesla at the moment either and everything. So
Right,
what are
right.
some of the things that you are thinking that people might want to consider as investments, as that is one of your specialties with your company and everything?
Sure. Well, I would say this, for folks that have been paying attention to some of these high flyers like NVIDIA, we talk about a concept called FOMO, fear of missing out.
Right.
And it's important not to jump into something just because it's already gone up a lot. It may not go up anymore, right? You don't want to be the hot potato, the one holding it, right? When the or musical chairs and you're the one left without the chair. So I prefer more a style of investing that I would say is more value investing
Mm-hmm.
in the long term, dividend stocks that are quality companies that have increased their dividends. You can let the dividends reinvest every year so that you get more shares. If they make $100 in dividends a year, you buy a couple more shares with that dividend check. So over the years, you end up with a lot more stock. That's how people get wealthy in the stock market, is reinvesting the dividends in just good, solid companies. And the thing is that unless you have the time to sit there and watch a company like Nvidia go up and down all day, it's not the right way for most folks to invest. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say because a lot of people, including the ones I was referring to, that is literally what they're doing. As a matter of fact, sometimes when we're doing our various shows, we will see that Sasha and even Shaquille is oftentimes watching, like you said, the stock market on a regular basis because Sasha is retired from his various jobs. Shaquille is actually relatively young. I think he's in his 40s now and
Mm.
everything, but definitely they are engaged in that process. So that is something that they are going to do. But the average person is not going to do that. In North Carolina, we just recently got something that I know has existed in Florida for years and has existed in other places. So, in terms of investment, what do you think about the what I call the quick hit investments? Because some people are going to be wanting to run off and get their lottery ticket, and right now we have sports gambling, which is what I was just referring to. Because we have sports betting, so I know that
Mhm.
GM is here. What is that thing? GM Bets or something like that. And then
MGM bets, yeah. Mhm.
FanDuel is here, and a number of the other kind of companies are like that. And of course, they did get some great revenues in
Mhm.
terms of the amount of money that was spent in the first couple of weeks. Because I want to say it was the beginning of this month that they uh, initiated being able to start it and everything. Because I think they timed it around the time, or it might have been the first of last month. They might have timed it around March Madness, but
Right,
they've only
right.
been around for about a week or two, and
Mhm.
all in that space. So I just wanted your take on this notion of sports betting or even the lottery as a way to quote unquote get rich quick.
Well, all I can say to that is how many people have won the lottery, big money, and
Right,
actually kept the money, didn't blow through it?
right.
Very few. So I think there's a karma involved there. And so, easy come, easy go.
Right.
Uh, yeah, it's fun. I mean, but it's not something that people should look at as the way to make money or for retirement. If you get lucky, great. But um, I'd be more concerned about saving that $10 here and there
Right.
and putting it in a couple shares of stocks than throwing it in, on some football game for the coming week because
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What is your thoughts? Because like I kind of alluded to it earlier, I think that when my grandmother was living and she created the first African American library in Raleigh, I want to say that she was the one that gave me a savings bond, and there was a time that there was a uh, fiscal trouble that I needed to go to that savings
Mhm,
bond, so I don't have it anymore and all in that space. But it
mhm.
definitely served the purpose at the time that I had it and everything. So I just wanted your thoughts around that notion of a tool of investment, whether that is a simple savings bond or a more complex one. Because I want to say she get the very basic one, and I want to say it was right after maybe a few years after college
Mhm,
that I needed it because of some financial
mhm.
troubles that needed to be fixed and all in that space.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Savings bonds are a great thing for people to buy for kids when they're young because there's that time that they'll, get to maturity and be worth something pretty significant. Bonds in general, are a good place for most people. Most people really are not as risky um, as they think they are, as far as what they're willing to risk in the stock market. And there are some tools online that can help you determine that by answer a few questions, and they'll tell you based on your temperament, right, what percentage you should consider having in stocks versus bonds, because bonds are not going to be as volatile as stocks are, which go up and down a lot every day. And
Are
so
there
I would.
any? I'm sorry. Are there any particular industries that you would suggest people get into when they're thinking about stocks? Because I know that one of our
Mhm,
shows actually tapes on Wednesday. Yeah, that's the time that Sasha does his investment show and
mhm,
everything. But I know that there are certain industries that certain people on that show are very passionate about. There are other industries that folks are less passionate about. So I just wondered, are there any particular industries that you think
mhm.
people should be engaged in if they are going to invest in stocks? Whether that's, like I said, I'm in the city of medicine, so there
Yeah.
might be some people that are thinking that medicine would be a good investment, particularly at this particular time, as many of the companies, whether that was Pfizer or that was Glaxo or a number of other ones, were involved in some of the early pandemic treatments and all along those lines. So I was just wondering, are there specific types of businesses that you think would be worthwhile looking into?
Well, what I normally tell people is, core investing in stocks, look at things that you use on a daily
Mhm.
basis. Like we call them consumer staples, right?
Yes.
Things that you need to use. And I'll use as an example, um, you've got detergent, you've
Mhm.
got uh, toilet paper,
Right.
you know, you've got things like that we really can't live without. Like we saw in the pandemic, you need to have toilet paper,
Right.
and so I would say you start there with the companies in the industry. We call it consumer staples.
Mhm.
Where in no matter a bad economy or a good economy, you're going to have people go out and buy those goods because they have to, right? It's a need, not a want.
Right.
So that would be my first industry that I tell people to go to. They all pretty much pay good dividends, and uh, you can search for your own brand names of the things that you like to use and
Right.
see who owns them. And then the other would be, of course, technology, right? But there are ways to invest in both of these sectors, not necessarily in individual stocks. You can do it using a mutual fund
Okay.
or an ETF as well, right? But obviously, technology is changing so
Mhm.
rapidly that to own one or two for the long term, you could pick the wrong one.
Right.
And so you're better off owning a basket of it in a mutual fund or an ETF.
Mhm.
So that way, you're getting the growth of the entire sector, not betting on one being the winner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Advice would you give to folks in terms of, because you kind of alluded to it way back in the beginning and everything, in terms of that work-life balance? Because that's something that I oftentimes talk about both on this show and on the online dinner party, which is my Wednesday afternoon show and everything. But how do you do that work-life balance? Because that's what I find a lot of people are trying to find is how to do that whole balance and act.
Sure. Well, I think you've got to, even if you have to schedule it in your calendar, step away from the screen,
Mm-hmm.
go outside, be in nature. Really, they've made it now so that we can work 24 hours a day if we really want to, right?
Yeah.
So it's up to us to get away from all of that electronics and noise and just be. So I had for many years, growing a business, it was tough to do that, and clients call you all hours and you want to answer their questions, but you've got to have boundaries for yourself, self care,
Yeah.
right? And self care, self respect,
Mm-hmm.
so that because then you're no good for anybody if you don't give yourself some time off, your brain to even
Right.
relax.
No, I definitely agree with you on that. You gotta have that self care, and sometimes it's just good to get, like you said, Mother Nature. Because actually, yesterday when I was leaving one of my part time jobs, I was noticing two geese that were out there and just observing them and kind of laughing. As a matter of fact, that's because I get around by mass transit, and even when I
Mhm.
got on the bus, I jokingly told the bus driver that I think the geese were trying to get on the bus, but I did think that they had fare, and the buses are free actually anyway, so they didn't need fare. But they definitely, I was like, I don't think we need to let them on the bus because disrupt the rest of us humans because they were certainly walking in our general direction. But sometimes having that like humor and just having some enjoyment, just seeing whether it's the robins or the geese or a number of other kinds of things that exist in Mother Nature.
That's
I
right.
just yeah, we definitely have to do that on a regular basis. The other thing that I talk about regularly, and I just want to hear your answer about this really quickly, and I have two questions I ask everybody that are
Mhm.
very quick and everything is
Mhm.
how do you deal with the notion? Because one of the things we talk about on this show and a lot of the shows on the network is this notion of, and you kind of mentioned it when you talk about FOMO and everything, is
Mhm.
this notion of being the inner critic. Because I know whether it's been in relationships, whether it's been on job offers or everything else, I have sat there and had entire discussions with myself by the time I got around to either approaching the young lady or approaching the job. The young lady had gone or the job had gone and everything. So how do you deal with that inner critic? We all face that inner critic. It can sometimes be worse than those outer critics, which can be our friend and family circle. But how do you address that inner critic, whether it is you going after a social life date or whether it's you going in the business world, which you have been very successful in, and all along those lines? So, how do you address the inner critic?
You know, I live in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And by living in the present, you stop being as critical, I
Mm-hmm.
think, number one. Number two is we're not in control of anything. That's an illusion. Really, at least in my belief system,
Right.
I know I'm not in control. There's only one person that's in control, that's God.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you um, accept that, right, then you can't get angry for making a wrong decision. You're human, right? And you learn from it and you move on. Um, when I talk about FOMO, because you mentioned FOMO and the fear of missing out, I learned a long time ago there's always going to be another good idea.
Yeah.
So I don't need to chase one because I know there'll be another one.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to sweat over if you think about it that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Definitely, there's going to be another idea that you might have that might even be greater and everything. I know one of the things that I get frustrated by, and I don't know, you might have gotten frustrated with it in your entrepreneurial ventures, and I don't know all of what the various
Mhm.
entrepreneurial businesses were, but do you have sometimes get frustrated when people try to co-opt your dreams? Because that's something else I've had conversations about where people were wanting their dream to be your dream, and it might not be the same dream even in the entrepreneurial space, because I know that sometimes people have got their own ambitions and they want you to bring your skill set to them and everything. And I'm not knocking that, because definitely you can help
Mhm.
people with their ventures and their business. But sometimes I think that they are co-opting into people's dreams and not thinking about whether it is a total match in terms of it being a working relationship. But I just wondered your
Mhm.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, I never really had that happen to me as I was an entrepreneur, starting my own businesses. But as a consultant and working with businesses that are startups, trying to help them along, I see how um, there's a fine line in it, being a consultant, of wanting to help them not make a bad mistake
Right.
and also letting them learn from the mistakes, right? Um, but, you know, I think that it's just important that we all help each other.
Mm-hmm.
And, if somebody looks at, I mean, there's tons of investment folks out there, right? What am I going to do? Hate all of them because they're my competition? No, right? I think that people that are solid quality professionals understand that there's plenty of business for everybody to go around, and maybe the way they want to do things is different than how I do it, but they're going to attract their kind of client and I'm going to attract my kind of client.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything. You kind of alluded to it, but one of the other things that we oftentimes talk about on the network in general is there are two very powerful words, but there are two small words and everything. So I was just wondering, how difficult do you find it to, even as a consultant, use those words of yes and no? Because definitely they can be two very simple words, but sometimes we are afraid of the reaction if we either say yes to something or we say no to something. So I was just wondering your take on that, because, like I said, there's only what yes is three letters and no is literally two and everything. But a lot of times we are afraid to use those very powerful words.
I think I think more people have a problem saying no
Mm-hmm.
in this society, and I think that's because we're afraid of the reaction
Yes.
that we're going to get, that we're going to alienate somebody, that we're going to hurt them, um, they're going to feel something negative by us telling them no. But it all boils down to authenticity.
Oh, yes.
And one day I realized that I can't control how someone feels
Mm,
when I say yes or no, but I have to tell the truth
right.
and be authentic.
And I'm a big
And
fan of authenticity. Authenticity is very important, and a lot of times people are being unauthentic, including some of the folks in leadership and all along those lines. Because I don't know about you, but I am not a fan of the fact that we've got, and I'm not knocking their ages, but I wish that there was some more youthful leadership and some more newer ideas. And the fact that we've got these two gentlemen, one in his early 80s and the other in his late 70s, one that may have some business success and one that may not have some business success because he was a career politician. But I really do wish we had two greater choices in what we are being offered in November. But unfortunately, this is what we're stuck with, and we're going to have an incumbent, whether it's a incumbent coming back from
Mhm.
after a 4 year break or it's back to back incumbency in the sense of Biden. But either way, I wish there were better choices. But that's just me. I don't know your thoughts on that and all along those lines.
Yeah, I hear you. It makes you wonder why we can't attract younger people to really. I mean, there was that, what was his name, Vivek, I guess, who was
Right.
a bunch younger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe a little too young though.
Yeah.
I mean, there's coming from an industry like the investment industry where gray hair is good.
Mm-hmm.
But you've been through a lot of cycles of the stock market ups and downs. I understand why I think people are more attracted to someone that's gray hair, right?
Right.
It's because they've been through a lot more.
Right.
Um, so, you know,
Yeah, but then you also have to
one of
wonder
the
as
maybe
to
one of
whether
these days
people
there'll
are
be some folks
also
that are,
stuck on you also have to wonder whether people are stuck on stereotypes, because I know there were a lot of folks that don't think that even though we got Kamala that we'll ever have a woman president, because there are still people that feel that the country as a whole is not ready to elect a woman. But I don't
oh,
necessarily agree with that.
yeah,
And then you have people that are afraid that we'll never elect somebody from the LGBT community. And I don't know how you felt about Pete Buttigieg, but I actually thought that he was a very smart and articulate gentleman, and he seems to be doing a good job in his current department and all along those lines. But I thought that he would be one that could be electable. But some people are thinking that we will never elect somebody from the LGBT community either, as well. So I think that we've got to get out of these stereotypes and just elect people
yeah,
because they are good for the job.
yeah. I think that's what it boils down to. Like I don't know why you would even worry about what somebody's sexual preference is, right? For whether they can do the job or not. And as far as I definitely don't think that there's any basis for us as a country saying we'll not have a female president. I mean, look at the female presidents that are prime ministers all over the world
Yes.
in countries that are, much more, let's call it patriarchal than ours. So I think it's just a matter of the right candidate
Right.
coming up the ranks. That that's all it's going to take.
Yep, I agree with you on that, and hopefully we'll see that in the not too distant future. I know there were a couple of them
Absolutely.
on both the Republican and the Democratic side that were being thrown out there as potentials and everything. So maybe it'll happen in the next several election cycles. We know it won't happen this time around unless something drastic happens with Mr. Biden and Kamala winds up running and everything. But like probably definitely 2028 or 2032, which is not that far away and all in that space. But as I was saying, one of the things I get all my guests to do, and definitely would love to have you do it as well, because like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, is if
Mhm.
you can tell any message of positivity that you would like to share, because we are a global network. So that's something I try to get all my guests to do, is share a message of positivity. And if you would let folks know how they can get in touch with you, if they're interested in getting some more consulting work from you, and if there's any things that you would like to share as well that you haven't had a chance to, I will give you the full screen and all along those lines. But that's the questions that I was getting ready to get to, and then we'll get out of here with a commercial. I think it's one of my friends' commercials that's in the food space, and I oftentimes torture people with this particular one and everything, because it is actually a vegan style dish and all
Ooh,
along those lines. So it is a
nice.
vegan food dish. Oh, actually, this is Kendu Spices one. So this is actually a herb that is all about natural food and all along those lines. I may bring the one about the vegan food on a later show and everything, but this will be Kendu Spices, which is a herbal company and all along those lines. So definitely any message of positivity that you would like to share with our global community and how you can be reached, and any other things that you'd like to share other than what we've already explored. And like I said before, you've been a great guest, and I would love to have you come
Oh,
back on
thank
this
you. I
show and
appreciate
other
it.
ones as well.
Definitely, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So, I guess I'll start with the fact that my company is Firsthand Research. We have a website, firsthandresearch.com. That's one ST handresearch.com. I do have a podcast myself that is called Don't Buy the Bull, after my book. So it's don'tbuythebull.io is where my podcast is at. Just launched it a couple of weeks ago. So check it out. And I would say that my message of positivity would be pretty simple. And that is, I think that we're all here put on this planet to learn one thing, and that's just how to love. And if we can all get through life not having regrets that we didn't love as much as we should, then the world will be a better place.
Definitely appreciate that. Was a great word of advice and everything. And like I said, we're going to go out with Can Do Spice and definitely all along those lines. And like I said, I'll definitely invite you back to some of our other shows as well and have you come in whenever you can and all along those lines. But I've thoroughly enjoyed our 2 hours plus of conversation, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well. But definitely
Definitely.
look forward to having you come back in the not too distant future.
All right. Take care.
All right, bye.
You know how people love to enjoy food and don't understand how to flavor their food or how to replicate a meal? They're interested in supplements but don't know where to begin? Well, what I do is I take the guesswork out of enjoying flavor and wellness with my flavorful spice blends so that they can create delicious meals with healing benefits. Can Do Spice was created to help cooks at any level enjoy healing through food. Every spice blend was designed to give added health benefits of natural herbs. Every blend is complete. There's no need to add any additional spice for a delicious meal. Saving you time and money while adding supplements to your meals can be both tasty and fun. My earliest memories in the kitchen began with my father, Kenny Can Do Bond, so it was fitting that I would name this line after him. I have always looked to natural remedies to supplement the body, and I found myself hiding herbs and minerals in foods for my family. That's when it hit me. Everyone needs Can Do Spice. Everyone should be having this. It's an exclusive brand for cooks at any level who want to create flavorful dishes with healing benefits that can satisfy the body and soul. Add a little spice to your life. Give Can Do Spice a try.